Welcome. Today we're talking about how to use Java JSON in I/O. JSON is the JavaScript object notation, so JSON. And it's a modern data standard. You're seeing it all the time on the internet. Unfortunately, however, we don't have pre-built support for this inside Java because, well, A, it's written for a different language, JavaScript, and it came after Java came out. So, of course, not quite built in. But we do have tools to actually read this. Now, you could go out and actually write your own custom parser. Don't, because it's a waste of your time and energy. But there are tools like the Jackson library that you can actually use to make this happen. And so we'll be using Jackson for these examples. There's also JSON from Google you can take a look at as well. But we'll be using Jackson so we can wrangle the JavaScript into Java objects. And so we can do some cool stuff with it. So the JSON structure, if you haven't seen it before, so JSON uses a key value pair for its components, and JSON keys are all strings, and the JSON values are made up of basic data types that we explicitly support here in Java. So we have numeric data types like int and double, easy peasy, Boolean, I know, and then string and arrays. And the arrays can be, of course, any of those other types of things. We can also have other JSON entities for nested JSON data types. And we'll take a look at that in another advanced video, but for the basic idea right now, we're going to talk about the basic JSON structure so we can use that and work with it. So the Jackson library is the one I told you that we'll be working with to make sure we can handle that JSON information. And it's Jackson, it's from fasterxml, and we can use it either by adding jar files to a project, or we can use it with a dependency tool like Maven, so it can integrate directly in our project. Take a look at my other videos on how to add jar files like this, so you can actually work with it in your project. I have a video that goes over this exact process for Jackson specifically. The Jackson library has three packages we want to use when we're actually working with this project. We've got three core components we're looking at. We have our core library we're going to use for type reference for array list of some type, and exceptions, of course, because we need to know about those. We have the data bind library, which have our object mapper tool. Yay! It's a great thing, wonderful, great to use. And serialization options, so we can actually write code that looks nice. And finally, our annotations library, so we can do some customization of our classes. We'll see some examples of that as we actually step through this project right here. So when we're getting Java from JSON, we first have to have a Java data type. It needs to match the data that's stored in our JSON object itself, or the JSON entity. And each property of that JSON entity, aka the things in the first half of the JSON key value pair, the keys of that, needs an associated data member or field for the Java type that we're working with. And they want to have the same name on that as well. Some of the older Jackson library requires a zero parameter constructor as well as setters, but the modern Jackson library supports a parameterized constructor, and you can also use a record data type, which I'm using for this example right here, so we can see how that works. And so we'll see that we can go through and make that work for this. And so you also need to be able to work with potentially unknown data. Unfortunately, I know this is weird, but out there in the data doesn't actually match the exact format you're expecting it to, and sometimes you might get extra information from that depending on the API you're working with. And so Jackson allows you to actually annotate your file so you can support that customization, so you can have extraneous information get ignored and not crash your application. So here we have a sample record. It's using that data type of a record, which is a lightweight class you can use in Java, so you don't have to do all the boilerplate code. And so we have our package and import statements for, in this case, we have the import statement for com.fasterxml.jackson.annotation.json ignore properties. This is one of those annotations I was talking about, so we can customize this, where we have the @JSON ignore properties, where ignore unknown is set to be true. So if I get extra information on this, where I get randomly, instead of a edited @ I get a modified @ name on my field. I know. But so I have it right there, and when I create the record, I just have my record type right here, where I have the specified parameters for the constructor and the data members of the class. It initializes them all right there, and so I have that record that can read for that. You could also use just a regular Java class with that, with the appropriate data members, getters, setters, and constructor for that as well. I'm using record for my example though, so that's what we're going with. So I don't read a single JSON value, just one JSON value at a time. Sometimes you need to do that. And so we're going to use the object mapper type. That's how we actually work with that. As the object mapper type has a oft overloaded method called read value. You can use this with strings, with files, with URLs, and even more. And the first parameter of the read value method identifies the data source we're working with. And the second parameter identifies the Java data type that we're storing inside that, identifies the Java type that we're wrangling from that JSON data. So here we have a read single JSON method we're using with this, my IO controller class. And so I have my controller app, the base of the URL, and the append that I'm putting on that URL to get whatever custom information I want to grab from that. I create just an object mapper using the default constructor right here, 0 parameters. And then I try, because again, I can't guarantee this is always going to work. And so if my base contains cat, because I'm using cats as a service for my example right here. So I create an internet cat named demo, and I do mapper.readValue. I create a URL from that parameter that I supplied of the URL base and the appended. And then the type that I'm creating, internetcat.class. So that uses the Java class information to actually create that type that I can store as internetcat using the JSON wrangling of the mapper.readValue method. And I return that demo. If I do have an exception right there, I have my catch my IO exception. I handle that off to the controller, and it can do whatever it needs to do for that. And I simply return my demo or null if I didn't return anything back from that. So that's all it takes to simply read a JSON value from a URL. And if I change that instead of a URL, if I read that value, I could have that go from a string or from a file or any other data source. It's the same basic approach to that read value method. I'm just using a URL because that's the example I did with my class this week. We can also read multiple JSON values. This is a really, really useful tool because we're not often just simply dealing with one data. We have lots of data coming in all at once, and so I have to actually use a lot of it for it. We're still going to use the same object mapper. We're going to still the same use read value method. We're just going to change that, so instead of the data source, we're going to use a type reference as its second parameter, which will make a list of the type we're working with. So it's really quite nice. And so if I read multiple sort of JSON list from URL, I have that same basic parameter sequence. And then I have my array list of some unknown type, the angle brackets question mark right there. Data is set to null, so I can store anything inside that. I can downcast it easily in my exterior access method. And again, if my source URL contains cat, so I'm talking to the cats as a service again. And so I'm going to do try and data equals mapper.read value, just like we saw earlier, from a new URL, just like we saw earlier. Oh my gosh, it's great. But now instead we have a new type reference and array list of a new type reference of an array list of internet cat. And then we have the anonymous instance right there that we create with that open and close squigs right there. So that creates an array list of internet cat type that I can read all that JSON data into and then reference via the data variable I just created and return that from their method. It's wonderful, it's easy, and it's great. Wonderful tool. Writing JSON is even easier than reading JSON. We just saw how easy it was to read it right there. Writing's even easier. All we have to do is specify how we want to make that happen, and we use the serialization.indentOutput option to make it look even prettier. Here we have a write list of JSON file. As you can see, I have an array list of some unknown type, so I can downcast this as necessary. And then the path I'm writing that to. I create an object mapper just like I've done for every other method in the sequence. Great. And then I do mapper.enable, and I pass it serialization feature.indentOutput, which makes the JSON output look pretty. I know, crazy. We want text to be easily human readable. I know. And then I just do a try block on there where I mapper.write value. I pass it a new file from that path that I just specified right there as a parameter, and the list I'm specifying as a parameter right there. It is easy. This is all you have to do, simply write data into it. So it's really, really easy to do. And again, I catch the error, handle it with my controller, and we're good to go. I hope this is a great example of how you can easily use and work with JSON to read and write JSON data using Java in your project. Take a look at how you can do this using records or other classes as well, and have a great time. Hope this is helpful. Cheers. See you next time. Bye-bye.